My ex-boyfriend invited me to his wedding to show off his wealthy fiance, but my plus one turned. My ex-boyfriend invited me to his wedding to show off his wealthy fiance, but my plus one turned the tables in the most unexpected way. To give some context, Dylan, 30 years old, male, and I, 22 years old, female, met back when we both worked part-time at Starbucks. At the time, I was still in college, trying to save enough money to finally move out of my parents' house for good, while he was working to pay off his student loans. Dylan's parents, unfortunately, were deep in debt due to their gambling habits and were unable to support him financially in any way. At first, we connected over casual conversations about our families, sharing stories about our struggles and the pressures we were under. It turned out we had a lot in common, and as time went on, those conversations turned into genuine companionship. We enjoyed each other's company, and eventually, it grew into something more. 2 years later, after I graduated, I had finally saved up enough money to move out on my own. I was so proud of myself for reaching that milestone. Dylan, however, was still living at his parents' house, stuck under the weight of his student loans. Seeing his situation, I offered for him to move in with me. I thought it would help him get back on his feet while also giving us more time together. He agreed, but because of his financial struggles, he couldn't cover his half of the rent. I decided to pay 80% of the total rent so he could manage just the remaining 20%. Other than the rent, we split utility bills equally, which seemed fair to me at the time. We had very different jobs. Dylan's work was hands-on and required him to be on site for long hours, while I had a corporate job with more flexibility. My boss was not concerned about where I worked as long as I hit my targets each month, which made my schedule much more relaxed than Dylan's. Because of his demanding work hours, he couldn't contribute much to the housework. I understood this and took on most of the household responsibilities: cleaning, cooking, doing the laundry, and washing the dishes. The only thing I asked of Dylan was to take out the trash since he was always the last one to eat between the two of us. But Dylan had a habit of forgetting this one simple task. I would remind him and he would promise to do it, only for me to wake up the next morning and find the trash still sitting there. I tried to let it slide, telling myself it was just a minor thing, but the frustration built up over time. One weekend, I had to work a shift, and when I came home, I found the entire apartment in a state of chaos. The kitchen counters were piled with unwashed dishes. Empty food wrappers and chocolate packets were scattered everywhere. The laundry had accumulated into a mountain, and yes, the trash was still there, untouched. I was beyond exhausted after my shift, and all I wanted was to relax. But looking at the mess, I couldn't bring myself to sit down. I spent the entire evening cleaning the apartment from top to bottom. I scrubbed the counters, washed the dishes, sorted and folded the laundry, and finally took out the trash myself. By the time Dylan got home, I was drained, but secretly hoping he would notice the effort I had put in. Instead, he greeted me with a quick hug, told me he missed me, and immediately settled on the couch to watch a game. He didn't even glance around the apartment or acknowledge the work I had done. Something inside me snapped. I felt invisible, unappreciated, and overwhelmed. Tears started streaming down my face before I could stop them. When Dylan noticed, he asked if something was wrong, but I shook my head and told him I was fine. I said I was heading to bed and once again reminded him to take out the trash. He nodded absent-mindedly. The next morning, unsurprisingly, the trash was still there. When Dylan came into the kitchen and asked me what was for breakfast, I lost it. I told him he could cook his own breakfast. He looked at me like I had slapped him and said I was being rude. That was the moment I started yelling. I told him how useless he was around the house, how he didn't contribute anything except excuses. He looked at me like I was overreacting and told me to calm down. That only made me angrier. I took a deep breath and asked him why he never remembered to take out the trash. He shrugged and said he always forgot. I then asked him what he actually did around the house, other than coming home and sitting in front of the TV with a beer. He started going on about how tiring his job was and how he deserved time to relax. I agreed, he did deserve to rest. But what about me? After working all day, I came home and cooked, cleaned, did laundry, and ironed his shirts for the week. All I ever asked from him was to take out the trash, and he couldn't even manage that. Dylan looked at me, completely calm, and said he never asked me to do any of the things I had been doing for him. He added that his job was incredibly demanding, and, as his girlfriend, I should have understood that it was my role to support him. Then he dropped the bombshell that really sent me over the edge. He said it wasn't a big deal because his mother had always done the same for his father. Hearing this made my blood boil. I had been breaking my back managing the household for a man who clearly took me for granted, and here he was comparing me to his mother, someone I was not, nor did I ever aspire to be. I took a deep breath, stared him straight in the eye, and told him I was done. No more cooking his meals, doing his laundry, ironing his shirts, or taking out his trash. I wasn't going to clean up after him anymore. I said it plainly and firmly. I am not your mother. We are equals, and you need to start acting like it. Dylan's jaw dropped, his eyes widened in disbelief, and he tried to protest, but I raised my hand to cut him off before he could utter another word. There's more, I continued. From now on, you are going to pay 50% of the rent, or you can move out. I'm not your caretaker or your financial safety net. His face turned pale and he stammered, asking where all of this was coming from. I told him the truth. I was exhausted from putting in so much effort for someone who didn't appreciate me and treated my contributions as if they were owed. I could tell he had more to say, probably some excuse or manipulative attempt to make me feel guilty, but I was running late for work and walked out before he could start. For the first time in our relationship, I had set clear, firm boundaries. And the best part? I didn't feel even an ounce of guilt. True to my word, I stopped doing anything for him. I cleaned up after myself and that was it. Watching him scramble around the house, searching for clean clothes or trying to figure out how to iron a shirt before work was oddly satisfying. At first, he thought I was bluffing. He left dishes in the sink, let the trash pile up, and assumed I'd cave in and take care of it all. I didn't. When the kitchen started to smell, I simply ordered takeout and ate straight from the containers, tossing them in the trash so I wouldn't have to step into that disgusting space. Dylan tried to argue with me multiple times. He kept saying that being a good partner meant taking care of him. Each time, I shut him down. A good partner appreciates what they're given, I'd say, refusing to budge. When rent was due, I paid my half directly to the landlord and informed her that Dylan would be responsible for his share. This infuriated him. He came home yelling, demanding that I go back to paying 80% like I had before. I reminded him calmly that he never thanked me for doing that. Why should I keep helping someone who doesn't value me? I asked. He had no good answer, and eventually he paid his part, grumbling the entire time. What struck me most was that throughout all of this, he never apologized. Not once did he acknowledge how unfair he had been or express any regret for taking me for granted. It was deeply disappointing, but also clarifying. I realized then that he had always been this way, I had just refused to see it. Our arguments escalated over the following months. Dylan became increasingly bitter, blaming me for everything and trying to manipulate me into reverting to my old ways. But I held my ground. Around this time, I got a promotion at work, a major milestone for me. Unfortunately, this only made things worse. Dylan must have heard about it from one of our mutual friends who also happened to be my coworker. That night, he came home drunk, his face red with anger. He barged into our room, waking me up in the middle of the night. At first, I tried to reason with him, asking if we could talk in the morning when he was sober, but he was insistent, slurring that he had something important to tell me. Annoyed and groggy, I sat up and asked what was so urgent that it couldn't wait until morning. What came next didn't even shock me. It just confirmed everything I already knew about him. Dylan, in his drunken state, confessed that he had met someone else. Her name was Bella, and I knew exactly who he was talking about. I had seen her at one of his office parties. She was the young, rich daughter of an industrialist, only working because her father insisted she gain some experience. Dylan told me, without a hint of shame, that he was falling in love with her. According to him, she was a real woman, unlike me. I stared at him blankly. In that moment, I didn't feel anger, heartbreak, or sadness. I felt nothing. If anything, I was relieved. Dylan's confession was the final piece of the puzzle, solidifying that I deserved so much better. I didn't argue with him or beg for answers. I simply got out of bed, left the room, and closed the door behind me. Looking back, I wish I had seen through him sooner, but better late than never, right? I had known for a while that our relationship was nearing its inevitable end. At this point, Dylan and I were nothing more than two people sharing a living space, pretending to be something we clearly were not. The spark was gone, and we had turned into what I could only describe as glorified roommates. When he started talking about our relationship that evening, I had already made up my mind. I let him ramble for a while, but eventually, I interrupted him mid-sentence. I calmly told him that I genuinely did not care about him seeing someone else, and in fact, I was happy for him. I suggested that we end things on good terms, breaking up amicably, and that he could move out of the apartment as soon as possible. Dylan stared at me, clearly taken aback, his brow furrowed in confusion. Then, as if he could not believe what he was hearing, he asked me if I was jealous of this new woman in his life. I couldn't help but smile, shaking my head softly. I reassured him that I was not jealous at all, that I was genuinely glad he had found someone. If anything, it made things easier for me. I admitted that his new relationship gave me the final push I needed to end ours without feeling guilty. That seemed to set him off. His face turned red and he demanded to know if my newfound confidence had anything to do with my recent promotion at work. I replied firmly that my promotion had nothing to do with this decision. Over the past few months, it had become abundantly clear to me that we were no longer compatible. I explained that we had transitioned into a purely platonic cohabitation, which was likely why he felt the need to seek fulfillment elsewhere. I thought my honesty would come as a relief to him, but instead, his anger escalated. He started yelling, his words laced with venom, accusing me of embodying everything he hated about modern women. According to him, women like me were obsessed with flaunting their careers as if that were a bad thing. Then he dropped the comparison I had been waiting for. Bella, the new woman, was so much better because all she wanted in life was to get married and have children. Despite his rant, I remained calm. I told him every woman has different priorities, and that was perfectly fine. Bella, I pointed out, came from an affluent family and probably did not have to care as much about building a career as I did. However, I enjoyed my work, and that was not something I would ever apologize for. If he wanted someone like Bella, I said, then he should be with her. There was no point in continuing this relationship if he was going to compare me to someone else constantly. I told him again that he should move out as soon as he could, and that it would be better for both of us. This seemed to hit a nerve. His eyes widened, and he sneered at me, asking how I planned to afford rent on my own. I calmly explained that my recent salary increase meant I could now cover the entire rent without needing a roommate. At this, he exploded, accusing me of showing off in front of him. He launched into a tirade about how Bella was not only richer than me, but her father had even bought her a house. He continued yelling about how I needed to change myself and become more compliant, finishing his rant with the classic line, "At the end of the day, men wanted housewives, not women who could out-earn them." That was the breaking point for me. I told him to shut up, that I was done arguing in the middle of the night. I made it clear that he had until the end of the month to pack his things and move out. Until then, he could sleep on the couch. He muttered something under his breath as I turned and walked away, but I ignored him. I was too exhausted to care. The following week, he slowly began packing his things. I was relieved to see the process moving along, excited by the prospect of finally having the apartment all to myself. But on his last night, when I came home, I was greeted by a scene that left me stunned. Dylan was sitting on the couch with Bella, laughing like they owned the place. When I walked in, Dylan barely looked up as he informed me that he wanted to show Bella where he had been living before moving out. The audacity of it all left me speechless. This was still my home, and he had not even asked for my permission to bring someone else here, let alone his new girlfriend. Despite my irritation, I chose to be polite. None of this was Bella's fault after all. I greeted her with a polite smile, but she met me with a contemptuous glare, not even bothering to acknowledge my words. I brushed it off, deciding not to take her attitude personally, and went to freshen up. Later, while I was cooking dinner in the kitchen, Bella walked in to get a glass of water. She lingered there for a moment watching me. Her silence made me uncomfortable. Finally, I asked if she needed something, but she just gave me the same disdainful look as before. I sighed and returned to my cooking, determined to eat in peace in my bedroom. After dinner, as I was heading back downstairs, I overheard their conversation. Bella's voice was clear, dripping with mockery, as she told Dylan how lucky he was to have upgraded from someone like me. I froze on the staircase, stunned by her cruelty. What shocked me even more was Dylan's laughter as he agreed with her. Then Bella asked him the question that cut deeper than I expected. Why did you even fall in love with her in the first place? Dylan's answer was what broke me entirely. He admitted that he had been using me from the start because I was gullible enough to pay for our dates every time we went out. He said he relied on me to lend him money back in college and had no intention of ever paying me back. He even revealed, with zero shame, that I had unknowingly paid more than half of the rent for the past couple of years. That little detail had allowed him to save a lot of money while I was cluelessly footing the bill, thinking we were building something together. I stood frozen, unable to process the words coming out of his mouth. A part of me had always suspected that he might have been taking advantage of my kind nature, but I never imagined it had been this calculated from the very beginning. It was like my worst fears were being confirmed, but they still managed to hit me like a ton of bricks. As if that was not bad enough, Dylan and Bella kept talking, casually dissecting our relationship as though it had been some kind of experiment, mocking me in ways I had not even considered. Every word felt like a dagger, each laugh twisting it deeper. My face burned with humiliation. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. With every ounce of self-control I could muster, I quietly turned and went back upstairs. Once I was in the safety of my room, the tears I had been holding back came pouring out. I spent the rest of the night crying silently into my pillow, my heart aching not just from the betrayal, but from the humiliation of it all. The next morning, when I finally mustered the courage to leave my room, I realized Dylan and Bella were gone. Dylan had taken the last of his belongings and officially moved out. As I walked around the now empty house, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in years, the weight I had been carrying was gone. I cannot even begin to describe how light I felt knowing that he was out of my life for good. That day, I cried tears of joy, danced around the living room, and decided to reclaim my space. I spent hours cleaning every inch of the house, scrubbing away every trace of him. By the time I was done, it was as if he had never existed in my world at all. The next few weeks were transformative. Living alone turned out to be more enjoyable than I had ever imagined. I stopped caring about the snide remarks Dylan and Bella had made about me that night. Their words held no power over me anymore. I rediscovered my own rhythm, my independence, and most importantly, my self-respect. Life was peaceful, and I felt like I was finally on the right path. That peace was interrupted 2 months later when one of our mutual friends casually mentioned at work that Dylan was getting married to Bella. The news hit me like a bolt of lightning. Married? Already? It felt impossibly fast, and I could not help but wonder if they had been planning this while Dylan was still living under my roof. Our friend then showed me their engagement pictures. There they were, smiling radiantly, looking as though they were the perfect couple. I felt a twinge of sadness, but it was not because I wanted him back. Far from it. It was the sting of knowing how much of myself I had wasted on someone who never deserved it. Still, as I stared at those pictures, I realized that I would never have been truly happy with him anyway. They seemed well matched, and if anything, I was relieved that chapter of my life was over. That evening, when I returned home, I found an unexpected envelope in my mailbox. It was a wedding invitation. As I opened it, my stomach churned with disbelief. It was from Dylan and Bella. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of mistake, or perhaps just a token gesture of politeness. But as I turned the card over, I noticed a handwritten note scrawled in the corner. It read, "I want you to attend my wedding so you can see the grand life I am going to have with Bella." For a moment, I just stared at the note, letting the sheer audacity of it sink in. He had invited me, not out of kindness, but to rub his newfound happiness in my face. The smug tone of his message reignited all the anger I had buried. After everything I had done for him, this was his parting gift, a petty attempt to flaunt his success. But instead of breaking down, I felt something else rise within me. If he wanted to play games, I would not go down without a fight. I took a deep breath, my mind already spinning with ideas. I RSVP'd yes with a +1. If Dylan thought he could humiliate me one last time, he had no idea what was coming. That night, I opened my laptop and began scrolling through Bella's social media profiles. I studied every post, every picture, every comment. It was tedious work, but I was determined. Hours passed, but then, finally, I found exactly what I was looking for. A smile spread across my face as I realized I had the perfect plan to turn the tables. Dylan would regret ever underestimating me. Update 1. Bella had broken up with her ex-boyfriend Jake. She had several posts with him on her social media, and their pictures dated all the way back to high school. It was clear that they had been together for a very long time. I was curious, maybe even a little nosy, so I sent Jake a friend request from my profile. To my surprise, he accepted it almost immediately. I decided to push my luck and sent him a message. When he actually responded, I was a bit taken aback. I had not really expected him to reply, but he did, and that kicked off a long conversation. I was upfront about who I was. I told him I was Dylan's ex, and explained my rather unconventional idea. I wanted to invite him as my +1 to Dylan and Bella's wedding. At first, he seemed intrigued but understandably confused about why I was reaching out to him after all this time. I laid it all out for him, why I wanted to do this and how this wedding invitation had been nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt by Dylan to rub his happiness in my face. Over the next few weeks, Jake started opening up about his past with Bella. What he told me was shocking, to say the least. According to him, Bella had cheated on him multiple times during their relationship. And the latest of her affairs? It had been with none other than Dylan himself. I had no idea about any of this. Jake explained how Bella always seemed to have a thing for older men, so when she announced that she was in love with Dylan while still dating Jake, he had not been entirely surprised. Their breakup, however, had been as messy as you could imagine. Jake told me she wanted to remain friends afterward, but he had blocked her from everywhere, wanting nothing to do with her anymore. From the way he spoke about Bella, though, I could tell he was still carrying a torch for her, even if he would not admit it outright. I shared my story with Jake too. I told him about all the years Dylan had used me, how he had chipped away at my self-esteem, and how both he and Bella had made a mockery of me. I poured my heart out, not holding anything back. Jake was genuinely shocked at how badly Dylan had treated me, and I could tell he felt sorry for me. After hearing my side of things, he finally agreed to be my +1. I was excited, maybe a little too excited. I could not wait to see the look on Dylan's and Bella's faces when I walked in with Jake. It felt like poetic justice. On the day of the wedding, I felt a mix of nervousness and exhilaration as I got ready. Jake and I arrived together, and as we walked into the venue, I immediately caught sight of Dylan. The moment he saw us, his expression shifted. His eyes widened in disbelief and his face turned red. He recognized Jake immediately. Dylan tried to act composed, but his anger was obvious. He came over and hissed at me under his breath, asking what I thought I was doing by showing up with Bella's ex. I just smiled at him sweetly and told him I was there to celebrate his big day. He had no choice but to walk away fuming because he could not cause a scene in front of all the guests. When Bella made her entrance, she looked stunning, of course, in her white gown. The ceremony went smoothly, and soon it was time for the reception. By this point, Bella had changed into a different dress. When she entered the room and saw Jake sitting next to me, her reaction was priceless. She froze, her face a mix of confusion and shock. She walked straight up to us and demanded to know what Jake was doing there. I kept my tone polite but smug, telling her I had invited him as my guest to show our support for her big day. Her face turned red with anger as she sputtered, asking Jake if we were dating now. Jake stayed calm and asked her if they could talk privately. He clearly did not want to create a scene. Bella threw me a venomous glare before nodding and walking off with Jake. The rest of the reception carried on, but as the minutes turned into an hour, Bella was still nowhere to be seen. People started to whisper, and her father looked visibly concerned. A bridesmaid eventually came running back into the room holding a note. She announced in front of everyone that Bella had run away with Jake. The note explained everything. Bella admitted that seeing Jake again had made her realize she still had feelings for him. She confessed that marrying Dylan had been a mistake, and she could not go through with it. The entire room was stunned into silence. Dylan looked absolutely devastated and furious. Bella's parents apologized profusely to the guests and asked everyone to leave. As I watched Dylan standing there alone, humiliated, I could not help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. His attempt to flaunt his life in front of me had backfired spectacularly. Since the wedding, I have had mixed feelings. I feel a bit guilty, but at the same time, I cannot deny the satisfaction of seeing karma catch up to Dylan. This was never part of my plan, and I had no idea Bella would react this way. I have texted Jake to ask what happened during their private conversation, and I will update when he replies. Update 2. He sent me this long, heartfelt text message where he pretty much thanked me for taking him to the wedding. He went on about how he felt like he owed me big time and said he honestly didn't know what he would have done if I hadn't been there. He also shared some updates about his situation with Bella. Apparently, they went on the honeymoon that Bella had originally planned to take with Dylan. I mean, talk about awkward, right? But Jake said they had some deep conversations during that time, and they also spoke to Bella's parents, who were understandably super worried about her after everything that happened. Jake mentioned he would meet with me soon to explain everything in person, and honestly, I am looking forward to some clarity. Meanwhile, Dylan has been blowing up my phone since the wedding. It started with calls, dozens of them, one after the other. When I didn't pick up, he moved on to sending me these long, nasty text messages, basically blaming me for the complete meltdown of his life and his marriage. I didn't respond to a single one of them. Why would I? I know for a fact that Bella and Jake running off together had nothing to do with me, and honestly, I had no energy to deal with Dylan's nonsense. But today, things escalated. Dylan decided to show up at my doorstep. Of course, he knew I'd be home. It's the weekend, and he's always been the type to use what he knows against people. At first, I refused to open the door. I told him through the closed door to leave, but he just kept yelling, saying he wasn't going anywhere until he got to talk to me. So I opened the door just a crack, just enough to make it clear I wasn't letting him inside. I told him flat out that if he had something to say, he could say it standing outside because he wasn't stepping foot into my house. That's when Dylan started going off. He shouted that I had completely ruined his life, and honestly, his tantrum would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. He told me he had already quit his job because he was convinced he'd never have to work again after marrying Bella. According to him, I had destroyed his big plan to live a cushy life off her wealth. He demanded to know why I had brought Jake to the wedding, acting like that one decision was the root of all his problems. At that point, I had had enough of his accusations. I told him straight up that I knew everything. I had overheard his conversation with Bella on the night of the wedding. You should have seen the look on his face. His eyes practically popped out of his head. I laid it all out for him. How I knew he had used me for years to pay his rent and cover our dates while we were together. I told him I did all those things because I genuinely loved him, but he never respected me, not even a little. I reminded him how he had cheated on me with Bella and how I never made a scene about it or interfered in their relationship, but inviting me to their wedding, flaunting his new life in front of me, that was the final straw. I told him he had absolutely no right to show up at my house and blame me for Bella leaving him. She was an adult who made her own choices, and if he wanted to be mad at someone, he should direct his anger at her, not me. That's when Dylan really lost it. He shouted back, saying it wasn't his fault I was so naive and couldn't see that he was using me all those years. He had the audacity to tell me I shouldn't punish him for the past. I just laughed at that point. I mean, what else can you do when someone is that shameless? He kept rambling about how Bella was supposed to change his life and how he had worked so hard to charm her. And then, as if it couldn't get any worse, he admitted that he had put all this effort into seducing her just so he could secure his future. Hearing that made my skin crawl. I didn't want to listen to another word, so I told him to leave my property immediately or I would call the police. He laughed in my face, saying I'd never actually call. So I pulled out my phone and started dialing right in front of him. That shut him up fast. He took a few steps back and started mumbling about how I was overreacting, but I didn't care. I shut the door in his face and told myself that this was the last time I would ever deal with him. Since then, I've blocked him on every possible platform and told my family about the whole incident just in case. I am planning to change my house locks and install a camera at my front door. If he ever shows up again, I'll have evidence to file a formal complaint. I am done letting him invade my life. Update 3. And honestly, I had no idea how much everyone would want to know what happened next. My inbox has been flooded with over 100 messages, all asking the same question. Did Jake and I ever meet? I guess I owe it to you all to finally share the story, and I am happy to report that yes, we did meet. A week ago, Jake reached out and invited me to lunch, saying he was ready to talk. Naturally, I was a mix of curious, nervous, and skeptical, but I decided to go. If nothing else, I thought it might bring me some closure. When I arrived at the restaurant, I spotted Jake immediately, but I also noticed someone sitting next to him. It was Bella. My first instinct was to turn around and leave. The last time I had seen her, she had practically declared war on me, so her presence felt like a trap. I braced myself, fully expecting a confrontation, but to my surprise, she greeted me with a polite smile and even stood up to shake my hand. Her demeanor was nothing like the hostile Bella I remembered. She looked genuinely calm, maybe even remorseful. I hesitated, but eventually sat down after Jake assured me that she was only there to apologize. What followed was a conversation I never expected. Bella started by apologizing, not just once but profusely. She admitted she had been out of line with how she had treated me in the past. Then, she dove into her story with Dylan, and let me tell you, it was a lot to unpack. She explained how Dylan had been overly friendly with her at work, always giving her compliments and paying her special attention. At first, she thought it was harmless. After all, they spent long hours together due to their demanding work schedules. But slowly, Dylan began to cross boundaries. He would complain about me incessantly, telling her how unhappy he was in our relationship. He even went as far as to say he wished he had a more attractive girlfriend, someone like her. Hearing this, Bella admitted she started to feel flattered. Who wouldn't, right? She was going through a rough patch with Jake at the time, and Dylan's attention felt like a validation she wasn't getting elsewhere. One thing led to another, and she ended up hooking up with Dylan once. She told me this with her head lowered, visibly ashamed. After that, Dylan began manipulating her, pushing her to break up with Jake by feeding her lies about how Jake wasn't good enough for her. He painted this picture of a future they could have together, constantly texting her about how perfect they were for each other. Bella, feeling both guilt and confusion, eventually broke up with Jake and took a chance on Dylan despite their age difference and everything else. She went on to explain how over time, things began to unravel. Dylan wasn't the man she thought he was, and she started to see his true colors. When she saw me, Bella confessed she felt insecure. She envied my independence, how I didn't rely on anyone to take care of me. That insecurity turned into jealousy, which fueled her hostility toward me. She apologized again, this time for hurting my feelings and treating me poorly. I could see that she was genuinely sorry, so I decided to share my side. I told her how hard I had worked to get to where I was in my career, the sacrifices I had made, and the resilience it took to build the life I had. She listened quietly, nodding with her eyes downcast. And then I asked her about what had happened during her wedding with Dylan, because let's be honest, that was the million-dollar question. Bella revealed that when Jake and I showed up, she was stunned to see him. She said it was like a wake-up call. Seeing Jake again made her realize just how much she still loved him. She admitted that she had never felt the same way for Dylan. Later, during the wedding, she and Jake had a private conversation, and they both confessed their lingering feelings for each other. It didn't take long for them to make a decision. Bella left a note for her family, and she and Jake ran away together that very night. They've been together ever since. Bella also mentioned that she had talked to her parents about everything. While they were understandably furious at first, they eventually decided to support her. She's now in the process of filing for an annulment with Dylan. Listening to all of this, I had mixed feelings. On the one hand, it felt like closure. On the other, it still didn't sit entirely right with me. But if Jake and Bella are happy together, I guess that's all that matters. After that, we finished our lunch and talked a bit more before going our separate ways. I haven't kept in touch with either of them since, and frankly, I don't plan to. I've had enough drama to last me a lifetime, and I want to focus on myself. My career has always been my priority, and I am determined to keep it that way. As for Dylan, I have no idea what's going on with him. Part of me hopes he learns from his mistakes and stops pursuing relationships for all the wrong reasons. But that's not my problem anymore. For now, I'm focusing on my own journey, and I think that's exactly what I need.